Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Stories here, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. This case centers on Diana Keel, 38, a reliable nurse from Nash County, North Carolina. In early March 2019, she missed a scheduled shift, something coworkers described as out of character. The hospital documented the concern, calls and texts went unanswered, and a missing person check began. No drama, just procedure. Within days, a state highway worker noticed a body off a rural cut-through in Edgecombe County, the next county over. He dialed 911. Patrol units secured the scene, logged approach routes, and requested detectives and the medical examiner. From that point forward, this file became two coordinated locations: residence in Nash County and recovery site in Edgecombe County, managed on a single, time-stamped timeline. Investigators kept the first steps tight and by the book. At the recovery site, they photographed fixed markers, tree line, culvert, fence post, documented weather and ground conditions, and protected potential trace without guessing how the body arrived there. They canvassed for cameras along the road and nearby properties, requested any commercial CCTV that might show vehicle traffic during the relevant window, and noted tire impressions where the soil allowed. Nothing speculative went in the notes, only what was verifiably present. Back in Nash County, deputies conducted a welfare check at the residence, limited in scope and distinct from a search. That distinction matters. If deeper processing is needed, you return with a court-authorized warrant to preserve both evidence and rights. Meanwhile, detectives began building a last known alive timeline: final confirmed calls or texts, last workplace contact, and verified movements tied to records rather than memory. Identification moved in layers. Presumptive markers, clothing, build, jewelry, were logged. Then the remains were transferred for formal medical examiner intake. Where available, fingerprints or dental records accelerate confirmation. DNA stands by if needed. Family notification follows policy. No cause of death was announced at the scene. Those findings come from the examiner, not from guesses made roadside. The early interview posture stayed neutral and structured. Friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers were asked for factual anchors: when they last saw or spoke with Diana, any planned trips, any recent health or safety concerns. Statements about relationship strain were recorded as statements, not as established fact. In a professional investigation, person of interest is not suspect, and neither word implies guilt. That discipline keeps cases intact. Digital and documentary evidence began to frame the map. Attendance logs confirmed the missed shift. Call records established who contacted whom and when. Camera queries expanded from the home corridor toward the Edgecombe pull-off where the body was found. In 2019, multiple data streams can be relevant, but the first 48 hours often lean on records that are hard to dispute: time cards, call histories, bank activity, and vehicle sightings captured on commonly placed cameras. Each source gets cross-checked against the others. Consistency is what earns confidence. Geography is the quiet fact that changes everything. A missing person report originates in Nash County. A body is recovered miles away in Edgecombe County. Distance implies transport. Transport implies a vehicle, a driver, and a choice of timing and route. Those implications dictate the next steps. Expand the camera canvas, look for corridor patterns, and test whether known vehicles tied to the residence appear on footage near the recovery window. None of that names a perpetrator. All of it narrows possibilities. And what you will not hear in this chapter are claims about cleanup, dramatic confrontations, or speculative motives. That material, if it appears at all, belongs where it is documented, later in court filings or sworn testimony. Here, the case moves on verifiable action: scene control, chain of custody, intake at the medical examiner's office, and a methodical build-out of the timeline. If you live in a small city like Nashville, NC, you know that quiet isn't proof of safety. It's just what a town sounds like before the facts arrive. The facts in this file were about to arrive. From the morgue, from the lab, and from records that don't care what anyone believes. The story you're hearing will follow that evidence and end where the court record ends: one victim, one investigation, one outcome. The first step after a body is recovered is not theory, it's verification. The remains found in the woods of Edgecombe County were transported under seal to the medical examiner. Intake began with standardized photography, clothing documentation, and an inventory of personal effects. A simple detail often matters more than any rumor: a wedding band still in place, cataloged and bagged. Chain of custody followed the textbook, who received when and what condition, because a crime file rises or falls on paperwork as much as on lab work. Positive identification moved from presumptive to confirmed. Height, build, hair, and jewelry aligned with the missing person report from Nash County, but confirmation required primary identifiers. Fingerprints were compared where reference records existed. Dental records, requested through the appropriate channels, offered a second route. Within the early window of the investigation, the examiner's office confirmed the victim as Diana Keel, age 38. Notifications followed policy. No conclusions about who caused her death were conveyed to the family, only what could be stated with certainty: identity and the status of the case as a homicide investigation in progress. Cause and manner were determined without spectacle. The examiner documented injuries consistent with blunt force trauma and sharp force injury. The language was precise, non-graphic, and confined to what the body could establish. The manner of death was classified as homicide. No timeline speculation was made from the table. Interval estimates were left to correlation with environmental conditions, witness statements, and digital records. That restraint is not caution for its own sake. It is what keeps a case intact when challenged later. Those medical findings immediately informed the next round of investigative tasks. Blunt force patterns narrow the universe of potential implements by mass, surface, and edge geometry. Sharp force injury requires a survey of edged objects with attention to width, taper, and potential tool marks. Investigators do not pick a weapon from a house. They inventory and submit categories of items the science indicates could be relevant. If an object has transfer material, the lab gets it. If an object is clean, it still may be relevant for comparison testing. The point is correlation, not assumption. Time frame matters. The examiner's report did not stand alone. It was placed alongside the timeline that began when Diana missed her shift in Nash County and continued through the discovery in Edgecombe County. Environmental data from the recovery site, temperature ranges, recent precipitation, and canopy cover supported a cautious window for post-mortem interval, always treated as an estimate. For voiceover clarity, the autopsy told investigators what happened to the body. The timeline, cameras, and records would help establish when and where the fatal assault likely occurred. The packaging of evidence reflected that split focus. Biological samples were preserved for potential DNA comparison should the case require it. Fingernail scrapings, if collected, were handled under sterile conditions and sealed. Swabs from select areas were retained according to protocol. None of this implied a suspect. It preserved options. When a case is built correctly, the lab can exclude as effectively as it can include. That is often how quiet communities learn what's true, by what the science refuses to confirm. Investigators updated the search strategy with the autopsy in mind. The recovery site showed no reliable signs of a fatal assault. It read as a place of disposal, not of attack. That conclusion came from the lack of on-site blood consistent with the documented injuries and from the terrain characteristics recorded by first responders. If violence occurred elsewhere, the map returned to Nash County and the corridors between the residence and the woods. Cameras were queried outward from both points. Vehicles associated with the residence were cross-checked against road segments that would plausibly intersect the pull-off where Diana was found. It wasn't dramatic, it was systematic. Communication records began to matter more. Call histories established last successful contacts. Text logs verified gaps. Payment card activity, where present, offered a separate trail of timestamps. In 2019, providers retain multiple categories of data. Investigators request only what is supported by probable cause and what a judge authorizes. The data aligned too cleanly, one detective would later say in an internal debrief. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean stories are tested twice. If you've ever asked why cases like this resist speculation, this is why. A single phrase on a report, blunt force trauma, is not a story, it's a directive. It tells detectives what to look for, where to extend warrants, and how to prioritize lab throughput. It tells prosecutors how to frame a probable cause narrative without outrunning the science. And it tells a family what can be said in the most honest way possible. The loss is a homicide. The details will take time because they must stand up in court. The human element does not get ignored, but it does get structured. Friends and coworkers who came forward with concerns did so in good faith. Their accounts were documented and cross-referenced with the formal findings here. If a claimed argument referenced a date, Investigators checked that date against any verifiable movement. If someone remembered a late-night drive, the camera canvas for that window grew. In towns like Nashville, quiet isn't certainty. It's just what the street sounds like until a timeline proves something happened there. What the examiner did not do is just as important as what the examiner did. There was no declaration about who committed the homicide. There was no attempt to place a specific object from a specific room in a specific hand based solely on the wounds. That work belongs to the full case file combining medical science, scene work, records, and eventually courtroom proceedings. The autopsy is the anchor, nothing more and nothing less. By the time the report cleared for investigative use, the file had a confirmed identity, a declared manner of death, and injury patterns that tightened the warrant scope. The next steps would follow that logic. Court-authorized searches targeting potential implements, digital extractions from seized devices, and expansion of the camera net along the route between Nash County and the Edgecombe Woods. No shortcuts, no leaps. When the public would later ask how the case reached a legal resolution, the answer would be visible right here. One documented decision stacking on top of another. In a homicide file, victimology is not biography. It is a tool. After the autopsy confirmed Diana Keel, investigators mapped who she was to the routines that anchored her days. A 38-year-old nurse in Nash County, North Carolina, known for showing up, charting accurately, and returning calls. That reliability gave detectives a baseline. Anything that deviated from it demanded documentation. The first passes focused on fixed records rather than opinions. Supervisors produced attendance logs confirming the missed shift that triggered the welfare check. Scheduling software showed the upcoming rotations she was expected to work. Payroll timestamps established her normal arrival and departure windows in the week before she disappeared. The purpose wasn't to humanize but to build the last verified alive window from hard entries that would withstand courtroom scrutiny. Phone activity came next, requested through proper legal process. Investigators looked for the last completed call, the last delivered text, and any sharp drop-off in messaging patterns. A cluster of unanswered calls from colleagues after she failed to report was logged. Earlier communications from family and friends were preserved for time correlation. In 2019, these datasets are common, but they don't narrate themselves. Analysts plotted the points against the calendar, then against the hours when the body was later recovered in Edgecombe County. The question was narrow. When can we prove Diana was alive, and when do the records go silent? Detectives documented what friends and coworkers had already hinted at, recent strain inside the marriage, marking every line as statement, not conclusion. Those interviews were handled with the same tone you hear in federal briefings, neutral, structured, and focused on dates. If a friend said Diana planned to spend a night away the previous month, the date went into the file and the hospital roster for that week was cross-checked. If a neighbor recalled raised voices at an approximate hour, that hour, and only that hour, was added to the camera canvas for nearby roads. The standard was tight: corroborate or carry it forward as uncorroborated context. At the residence in Nash County, the initial welfare check remained just that. Eyes on, no intrusion beyond legal authority. The driveway inventory noted vehicles typically present. Exterior observations recorded lighting, entry points, and any cameras mounted outside. Mail accumulation was photographed. None of it asserted where an assault occurred. The autopsy had already indicated a level of violence that the recovery site did not physically support. By process of elimination, the likely locus shifted back toward the residence or another enclosed setting. But likely is not enough. The next step would require court-authorized access, warrants with scope grounded in what the medical findings demanded, potential blunt and edged implements, relevant digital media, and items capable of documenting movement. Hospital HR provided the emergency contacts they keep for all clinical staff, which confirmed who had been called and when, once Diana failed to report. Those records also supplied a secondary benefit: names to prioritize for interviews, ordered by closeness and recency of contact. The sequence of interviews mattered. Detectives began with the people whose accounts could be anchored to documents: a charge nurse who could speak to the missed shift and prior punctuality, a scheduler who could verify that no swap had been approved, a friend who texted Diana about a ride and received no reply. Each detail was paired with a record that either supported it or did not. When witness memory drifted, the record held the line. The neighborhood canvas expanded beyond the home. Patrol units checked for privately owned cameras that might have captured a vehicle departing at an odd hour or a trunk opening in a way that suggested loading rather than ordinary use. In towns like Nashville, routine is visible. When routine breaks, it leaves marks. Detectives asked residents to retain any recent footage and issued notices about the general time frame without revealing investigative theory. That privacy protects cases and communities. It also prevents contamination from public speculation. A separate team examined digital life. Social accounts, where relevant, were preserved under applicable law. The point was not to narrate relationships, but to establish timestamps and potential travel notes, check-ins, calendar entries, or messages about errands. Bank activity, if present, served as a confirm or deny tool. A small purchase at a gas station during a claimed time, a lack of activity after a certain hour. None of this rested on guesswork. It was the arithmetic of a life that had been paused. The human side of this step was real but measured. Co-workers who had expected to see Diana on shift described her as consistent and private. Friends recounted concerns she shared in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Family relayed that she was planning for stability, work, routine, and safety. Those elements matter because they reduce the chances that she left by choice. They also explain the speed with which people who knew her escalated from worry to a formal report. Reliability isn't just a personality trait. In an investigation, it is evidence about likelihoods. A small but important detail emerged from the autopsy intake: jewelry still present and cataloged. That observation fed back into the victimology profile. Expensive items missing at recovery can indicate theft. Items still present can point away from robbery as a primary motive. No single fact closes a case, but each one narrows or widens the aperture of what to look for. Here, the lens stayed on personal proximity and access. Who could enter the home, who had reason to know her routine, who had a vehicle capable of moving a body, and who had time to do so within the proven windows. By the end of this phase, the file contained a tight, last alive to found arc. A reliable nurse fails to appear. Communications stop. Days later, a body is located in a different county. The medical examiner's findings dictated which objects and records could be probative. The witness statements dictated which time slices to search first. The data aligned more cleanly than most cases. Sometimes that is the problem. To avoid confirmation bias, supervisors pushed for secondary verification on every core claim before they authorized the next step. That next step, given the autopsy and the relocation of a body, would be court-approved warrants to gather potential implements and digital devices for testing. A case like this moves forward by restraint, not flourish. There is a community dimension to victimology that's easy to miss on paper. A hospital unit runs short when one of its own doesn't show. Uniforms from 2 counties converge on a wooded stretch of road that most people drive past without noticing. Neighbors realize how little they know about what happens after dark on their own street. Telling the truth about a case means acknowledging the people left to live with it. Structured investigations serve families because they aim at facts that stay true, not stories that feel right. The bridge to the next chapter is procedural. With identity confirmed and injury patterns established, investigators sought judicial authority to search the residence and seize items that the lab could either implicate or exclude. That is not a theory. It is the lawful mechanism a homicide file requires to answer the questions the autopsy raised. The autopsy gave investigators 2 directives: blunt force and sharp force injury, and a timeline anchored by a missed shift and a body recovered days later in a different county. To move beyond interviews and observations, detectives did what the law requires. They wrote affidavits, took them to a judge, and asked for narrowly tailored search warrants. The application laid out verifiable facts only: the missing person report in Nash County, the identification of Diana Keel, the recovery of her remains in Edgecombe County, and medical findings that justified looking for potential implements and digital records that could document movement and communication. The judge granted authority with scope limits that would hold up later. Time of day restrictions, knock and announce, and an itemized list kept the operation surgical. The residence in Nash County was entered under warrant. The initial welfare check had been carefully separated from this moment to preserve the integrity of the case. From the threshold forward, every action lived on paper: date, time, officers present, rooms cleared, items observed, items seized, who bagged them, and how they were sealed. That is how you prevent a crime file from bleeding credibility in court. The inventory that followed was extensive because the house contained a lot that could matter, or not. Firearms were documented by make, model, and serial where present. Edge tools and blades were measured for length, width, and edge type. Digital media, desktops, laptops, external drives, phones, memory cards, and loose storage devices were prioritized for imaging rather than immediate analysis on site. Investigators also seized a small device consistent with a consumer tracking unit. None of these objects by themselves declared guilt. They were categories of evidence the medical findings had made potentially relevant. Chain of custody was the spine of the day. Each bag wore a unique number. Each number had a handler. Photos captured objects in situ before removal and again once packaged to preserve both context and condition. Items that could transfer trace, fibers, hair, or microscopic particulate were handled with gloved discipline and placed into appropriate containers to avoid cross-contamination. Nothing was tested in the field. Everything moved through intake to the lab where conclusions would be earned, not guessed. Digital forensics spun up in parallel. Devices were stabilized, write blockers attached, and forensic images created with cryptographic hash values recorded to prove integrity. What was copied matched what was on the device bit for bit. Only after imaging would analysts explore contents under proper authority: messages, call logs, contact lists, calendar entries, and document metadata. If GPS artifacts existed, they would be treated according to law and scope. This investigation did not rely on an assumption that phone location would make the case. Instead, analysts focused on communications timing and corroboration: who texted when, who called, and whether those timestamps aligned with the already proven windows from Victimology and the autopsy. The firearms and edged tools did not go straight to match, no match. First, they were visually inspected for condition and any obvious biological material. Then they were routed by need: possible DNA swabs to serology, latent print processing to the print lab, class characteristic measurements to the toolmark unit. A hammer, for example, doesn't match a skull in the way a fingerprint matches a finger. It presents dimensions and surfaces that can be compared to the injuries described by the medical examiner. The question is not whether an object is the weapon. Few cases yield that kind of certainty, but whether an object is consistent with class characteristics of the injuries or inconsistent and therefore excludable. Exclusions matter. They keep a theory honest. Search teams extended their work to vehicles associated with the residence under separate warrants, limited to areas likely to retain relevant trace: trunk liners, floor mats, and accessible compartments. Again, this did not presume where the assault occurred. It respected the autopsy's implication that the fatal violence likely happened away from the recovery site and recognized that transport had to be accounted for within the documented windows. If a trunk liner showed nothing, that was logged. If a mat held fibers or particulate that warranted testing, it moved under seal to the lab. The case would be built by what the science showed, including silence. Neighbors were notified that a lawful search was underway, and media inquiries were routed to a single public information officer. Investigators kept the focus on the work rather than speculation. In towns like Nashville, North Carolina, warrants do more than open doors. They protect cases. They also protect the community by ensuring the process doesn't outrun the evidence. That clarity eases tension for families who want answers and for viewers who expect a straight story. The residence search concluded with a walkback to ensure nothing had been overlooked and a receipt left that listed every seized item. From there, custody shifted to the lab and the digital forensics unit in a schedule designed around efficiency and defense-proof method. Imaging first, triage second, deep review third, with separate examiners assigned to avoid cross-influence between digital and physical conclusions. Supervisors emphasized a rule that often decides whether a case survives trial. Do not let a narrative assemble itself in your head ahead of the lab reports. If a knife is clean, say it's clean. If a device holds no relevant traffic during the window, say that too. Why spend time on process when people want answers? Because process is what gives you answers you can stand behind. A family will hear about seized items. A community will hear that many were taken. A careful narrator will add the only statement that matters here. Seizure is not proof. Lab results, not headlines, will tell this story, and those results were now on the clock. Before teams cleared the scene, The lead detective briefed the district attorney's office on scope and status. The message was simple. The lab work would take time, but the file had moved from concern and recovery to evidence and analysis without cutting corners. That fidelity to method is an act of respect for Diana, for the court, and for the public who will judge the final outcome by how it was reached, not just what it is. The bridge to the next chapter is straightforward. As the house went quiet and the lab lit up, a different urgency surfaced. The person investigators most needed to re-interview was no longer easy to reach. The timeline was tightening. The next moves would leave the front yard and head west. By the second week after Diana Keel's disappearance, the investigation in Nash County had shifted from broad search operations to a focused forensic review of every available lead. With the recovery of her body now confirmed, the priority became determining the sequence of events leading up to her death and identifying the individual responsible, without making premature assumptions. Detectives began by consolidating all physical evidence already collected: personal items found near the discovery site, photographs of the location, and any forensic samples retrieved by the medical examiner. Because Diana's remains were located in a rural area off a secondary road, the condition of the body limited the ability to determine a precise cause of death. This required investigators to lean more heavily on digital forensics and timeline reconstruction. Cell phone records provided the first significant development. Analysis of tower pings indicated that Diana's phone had last connected to a network near her home on the day she was last seen. After that, there was no activity, no calls, no texts, no data usage. The absence of movement in her device history was unusual for her known habits. Attention then turned to surveillance footage from businesses along potential travel routes between her home and the eventual recovery site. Investigators reviewed hours of video, focusing on a narrow time frame derived from both the disappearance date and weather data that could help estimate when the remains had been placed there. A vehicle matching the description of the Keel family's pickup truck was captured traveling west out of Nash County in the early morning hours after she was reported missing. The driver could not be identified from that footage alone, but the timeline alignment raised immediate interest. Parallel to this, financial transaction records were pulled. Diana's debit and credit card accounts showed no activity after the day she vanished, while her husband's accounts reflected purchases for fuel at a station near the state line during the relevant period. The receipts were time-stamped less than 48 hours after her disappearance. The investigative team also pursued interviews with coworkers and acquaintances. Colleagues from the medical practice where Diana worked described her as consistent, punctual, and communicative, traits they emphasized to highlight how uncharacteristic her absence was. Several noted that she had mentioned personal tension at home in recent weeks, but none could provide specific incidents or dates. Forensic specialists examined items collected from the Keel property under search warrant. Soil samples from the truck bed were compared to samples from the location where Diana's body was found. Preliminary lab reports indicated a probable match, strengthening the hypothesis that the same vehicle had transported her to the disposal site. Each of these findings, while not conclusive on their own, began to form a chain of circumstantial evidence. The coordination between digital analysts, crime scene technicians, and investigators ensured that any conclusions drawn would withstand legal scrutiny. The team now had a working theory on both the movement of the victim after her disappearance and the potential involvement of a known associate, but they were careful to keep the scope narrow until corroboration could be achieved. By this stage of the investigation, the file on Diana Keel's murder was no longer a collection of scattered reports. It had become a structured narrative of evidence, physical, digital, and testimonial, each piece tested, verified, and cross-referenced. Nash County detectives worked to close the final procedural gaps before presenting the case for trial. The autopsy report, delivered by the North Carolina Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, confirmed multiple blunt force injuries to Diana's head and torso. While decomposition limited some findings, the injury patterns were consistent with repeated impact from a broad, rigid object. Toxicology revealed no incapacitating substances, eliminating speculation that she had been drugged prior to her death. In parallel, forensic technicians revisited the family home. Earlier scene processing had focused on high-visibility areas, living room, kitchen, and master bedroom, but the team now examined transitional spaces such as the garage entryway and utility room. Swab samples taken from baseboards and the underside of a washing machine returned DNA matches to Diana, consistent with transfer from cleaning attempts. No single discovery changed the case. Instead, It was the cumulative weight of small, corroborating facts. Digital evidence provided a complementary timeline. Cell site data from both Diana and Rexford Keel's phones showed that in the 24 hours preceding her disappearance, their devices were together at the residence, then separated in the early hours of the following day. Surveillance cameras from a rural roadside captured a pickup truck matching Keel's vehicle traveling toward the area where Diana's body was later found. Metadata from these files aligned with GPS-tagged photographs recovered from Keel's own phone, images he had attempted unsuccessfully to delete. Witness statements were equally strategic. Co-workers testified to Diana's growing concern about her safety, supported by text messages she had sent days before her death. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices from the Keel residence on the night she was last seen alive. These accounts taken together reinforced the prosecution's theory of escalating domestic conflict culminating in fatal violence. By late summer 2021, the district attorney's office advised that the case was trial-ready. Prosecutors offered Keel a plea arrangement, a no-contest entry to second-degree murder, ensuring a substantial prison term without the uncertainties of a jury verdict. Defense counsel weighed the strength of the state's evidence, physical injuries, DNA trace, digital trail, and advised acceptance. In October 2021, Rexford Lynn Keel Jr. was sentenced to 32 to 41 years in the North Carolina Department of Corrections. From an investigative standpoint, the resolution demonstrated the value of methodical, corroborative work over sensational breakthroughs. No single lead solved the crime. Rather, each department, crime scene, forensic lab, digital analysis, witness coordination, contributed a vital thread. The result was a tightly woven case that withstood legal scrutiny. In reviewing this outcome, one question lingers for many observers. When early warning signs of domestic violence are visible, what interventions, personal, institutional, or legal, might disrupt the trajectory toward fatal outcomes? By mid-March 2019, the case of Diana Keel's death had moved from local forensic work to a multi-state manhunt, the Nash County Sheriff's Office, having already established probable cause for Rexford Lynn Keel Jr.'s arrest, entered his warrant into the National Crime Information Center (NCIC) system. This ensured that any law enforcement officer nationwide who encountered him would receive an immediate alert. Deputies confirmed that Keel's vehicle, a gold-colored Chevrolet pickup, was no longer at the residence. Surveillance from nearby traffic cameras placed the truck heading west on Interstate 40 within hours of detectives making their first public appeal for information. The North Carolina State Highway Patrol relayed this intelligence to the U.S. Marshals Service, which activated its Fugitive Task Force network. At this stage, investigators combined license plate recognition, LPR alerts with financial activity monitoring. Keel's known debit and credit cards were flagged for transaction reporting. Within 48 hours, a small purchase was recorded at a gas station in Central Texas. The transaction provided both a timestamp and a location, allowing task force members to narrow the search corridor. While Texas law enforcement partners were advised, the trail advanced again when Keel's vehicle was identified by an LPR system in Arizona. Detectives cross-checked the hit with the interstate camera network, confirming direction and speed. Given the proximity to the Mexican border, the risk of flight from U.S. or jurisdiction was treated as imminent. On March 23, 2019, Rexford Keel was intercepted by U.S. Customs and Border Protection near Tucson, Arizona. The arrest was executed without resistance. A search of the vehicle at the scene documented clothing, personal effects, and no firearms, consistent with reports that any weapons had been left behind in North Carolina. Following his detention, Keel was transported to the Pima County Jail to await extradition. The arrest report noted his physical condition as stable and documented the reading of his Miranda rights. Statements made at that point were limited, but he acknowledged awareness of the charges pending in North Carolina. From an operational perspective, the arrest demonstrated how combining local investigative leads with federal interagency coordination can prevent a fugitive from leaving the country. No single department could have secured the outcome alone. The handover between local deputies, highway patrol, and federal agencies was precise, timely, and legally compliant. After days on the run, Rexford Lynn Keel Jr. was captured in Arizona and extradited to Nash County, North Carolina. Prosecutors charged him with the murder of his wife, 38-year-old nurse Diana Keel, a case that had shaken the community since her disappearance and the grim discovery of her body. In court, Keel entered a no-contest plea in October 2021. Under U.S. law, this meant he did not admit guilt, but accepted the conviction and sentence as if he had pleaded guilty. The judge handed down a sentence of 32 to 41 years in prison, citing the severity of the crime and the impact on Diana's family. For her loved ones, the legal outcome brought a measure of closure, though not healing. Diana was remembered as a dedicated mother, skilled nurse, and a friend who never failed to offer comfort to others. Her death served as a stark reminder of the hidden dangers within troubled relationships and the importance of recognizing early signs of control, isolation, or abuse. The sheriff's office emphasized that while justice had been served, the case was also a call to action, urging neighbors, co-workers, and friends to speak up when they suspect someone may be in danger. In the words of one family member, "We couldn't save Diana, but maybe her story will save someone else." This was not just a crime. It was a tragedy that underscored the value of community vigilance, the resilience of those left behind, and the lasting need to protect the vulnerable before it's too late. Looking back on Diana's story, I'm reminded that danger often hides in plain sight, and sometimes the people closest to us can cause the deepest harm. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: speak up when something feels wrong and never ignore the warning signs. Your life or someone else's may depend on it. What are your thoughts on this case? Have you ever seen red flags in a relationship that others overlooked? Share your experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if this story resonated with you or even challenged you, let me know where you're watching from. If you found value here, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next story we share together.